Everyone, to our fourth alumni career conversation of the semester. So today we're talking to Kyra Luck, who graduated from BC in 2018 with an international studies major. Kyra currently works as a corporate legal assistant at White & Case, a global law firm based in New York City that serves companies, governments, and financial institutions. Grace and I will start by asking Kyra some questions that we think everybody would be interested in, but after that we will open up the floor for students to ask any questions that you might have. If you have any questions that come up during the conversation, feel free to send them to me in the chat, or you can just save them for the Q&A. And just so everyone knows, we're recording this conversation so that people unable to make it can still watch. Okay, so we can get started. Kyra, could you briefly introduce yourself and maybe tell us a bit about your experience at BC, what you're doing now, and your plans for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. Kyra Luck is my name. I graduated in 2018. I was an international studies major. I had a focus in ethics and international social justice and a minor in history. I studied abroad in Geneva, Switzerland. That was a really high point of my educational experience. And while I was there, I was working at nonprofits. The nonprofit I worked at in Geneva was R20, which is Arnold Schwarzenegger's organization. And he focused on creating climate ecosystems. So in order to fund projects, he would find financiers and then they would connect them to sustainable development programs. So that was an extremely rewarding experience that I had, and it was one that introduced me to the nonprofit world. After that, with my focus in ethics, I was very much focused on going into nonprofit sphere. I worked at another non-governmental organization down in DC between my summer of my junior and my senior year. That one was called One. It was more of a lobbying campaign, and it advocated for the measures that would prevent disease and poverty. So we would go to the Capitol and we would lobby while we were there. And I was focused on government relations while I was in that position. And it was very interesting being a part of the Capitol, but I just felt like I was missing a significant knowledge about how the government worked, how the legal atmosphere around that functioned. And as a result of that, when I was looking for jobs after graduation, I had initially started looking for things that were focused in the nonprofit world. I had a few final round interviews at organizations like Charity Water, Amnesty International, and that's what I very much thought I wanted to do. But after having those final round interviews, I would get to the point where they would say, "Thank you very much for applying. We have chosen to go to a candidate who has graduate experience." And at that point, I realized that I would need to have something to leverage in order to advance my career. So that's when I started looking at paralegal positions, and I was focused specifically on things that would allow me to have pro bono experiences. And the way that I got to White & Case was because founder George Case actually helped start the International Rescue Committee. And when I was researching organizations, that really stood out to me, and a lot of the attorneys that I spoke with on my interviews emphasized how important pro bono work was. So from my undergraduate experience to that initial application into accepting a job, I was very much focused on finding a way to use my international studies experience in a creative way that necessarily wasn't the one that I thought it would be, but would allow me to continue doing what I think would be beneficial for forwarding the common good. As VC, we want to be men and women for others, and I didn't want to just didn't want to do a job that I felt had no purpose or meaning in it. So that's why I was very much drawn to a company after graduation that still had a mission that was focused on pro bono and giving back to the community and the greater good.
Awesome. So you touched a little bit on like your job search. Sounds like you had a lot of like really interesting opportunities you pursued. But we were wondering like how you really structured that approach. Like, was it mostly through, personal connections or databases like Handshake, that sort of thing? And do you have any like do's and don'ts regarding the post-grad job search?
Absolutely. So I started my search a little bit later than other people did. My senior year, I chose to write a senior thesis. And at the time, only 6 international studies students chose to write a thesis. So I was a little bit distracted during the second semester of my senior year focusing on that. And I was not as involved in the job search process as my fellow students were. That made me very nervous, but at the same time, I knew I had to write 100 pages. So that took a lot of time and effort. Once I finished that, I really started creating a structured Excel spreadsheet. So I would keep track of every job that I applied to, when I applied, to whom I addressed the cover letter, if I sent supplemental materials, and then if I heard anything back. I thought that that structure for myself was very helpful, just to make sure that I was following up with jobs, because a lot of the emails that I was sending and the cover letters I was sending, I would hear no response from. So as a result of that, I found it to be extremely helpful to follow up about 2 weeks after if I didn't hear anything, just re-expressing interest. And I found that that led to a lot of interviews, because these jobs are just getting so many applications, and a lot of people will send very generic forms. And as a result of that, it just gets lost in an inbox. I definitely think reaching out on LinkedIn was extremely helpful for me. I mentioned I had that interview with Charity Water, and I stalked so many BC alumni who are in the nonprofit world on LinkedIn. I would reach out to them doing cold emails and say, like, hello, this is who I am. This is what I'm interested in. I see you're doing a job that I would love to have. Do you have a moment to chat? I would never ask for a referral in that initial meeting, but once you have the conversation with someone, they are usually so wonderful, and they will volunteer to refer you to something, or say, like, please put my name on a cover letter. And that really helps. So I ended up doing that for Charity Water, and it was wonderful because it got me an interview, but at the same time, I had mentioned, like, I had spoken with this person and he was wonderful. And when I went into the interview, they assumed that I had like a very long-standing relationship with him. Meanwhile, I had never met him in person. We had had a 20-minute phone call. So I think making sure to not overstretch the connection is very important. It was definitely something that I learned, and I would make sure to revise in the future if I'm going to reapply to a job again, just because I think that hurt me a little bit. It helped get the interview, but then it made it seem like I was putting on more of a show. But again, I would reach out via LinkedIn, and then my job position from White and Case I found on Handshake. I would definitely use that, because the firms and organizations that work with BC specifically are trying to recruit students from BC. I noticed that almost all of the jobs I applied to through Handshake, I would at least get like an interview or a phone call or an acknowledgement that I had applied. Meanwhile, if I did something through LinkedIn, I would, that's a black box. I would rarely get a result from a LinkedIn job application. I think there's still merit in applying via LinkedIn, but I just would not necessarily invest as much time in writing a cover letter for something like that. Another way is if you really are interested in working at one organization, a lot of times they'll have a resume drop. White and Case does that. So if you're interested in applying and there's no job position listed, if you add in your resume, when something becomes available, then they will look at you if they're interested in your credentials and experience. I really, really emphasize though, please, if anyone is interested in working at White and Case, reach out to me, because having anyone refer you makes it so much easier for you to get an interview. It honestly bumps you through that first step, and it really helps in that application process.
Thank you so much. All of this advice is super helpful, and definitely something that I wish I had incorporated into my job search this year. So I guess we're just wondering, like, if you could tell us a bit more about your day-to-day work as a legal assistant at a big law firm, and what types of responsibilities you're given, since you are not an attorney yet.
Absolutely. It depends. So mine is very niche. So my experience might not speak to everyone who works at my firm, because I am assigned a subsection. So within White and Case, we have corporate and litigation. I'm in that corporate pool. And then within that pool, I'm in capital markets. And then within that pool, I'm in securitization. So I'm the only like super specialized legal assistant that they have, but it was because of the amount of work that the securitization team does. They just needed someone to be able to be fully dedicated to that work. It's not necessarily something that I was tremendously interested in before applying to the job, but when I was having my interviews, I was extremely honest about that. I told them I wasn't sure if I wanted to go to law school. I was expressing that I really had this whole passion about going to a nonprofit. I might want to leverage this to go get like a graduate degree that is not a JD. And they were very supportive of that. But on the day-to-day basis, what I do is a lot of organization. So being a type A person, like a lot of international studies students are, it really helps because you have to keep track of all of the things that the attorneys are doing. For my transactions that we work on, we'll usually represent one party. So someone who is like an issuer or a collateral manager. And what we'll do is make sure that all of the documentation in order to close the deal is completed. There are condition precedents that have to be matched in order for the whole deal to close. So we have to make sure that those are met. And the way we do that is we keep a checklist running of all of the documents that have to be drafted, all of the counsels that have to send opinions and things related to those documents. And we'll go through and make sure that everything is there, and that responsibility really does fall on the legal assistants because it's very organizational. We'll make sure that when something comes in, we will mark it for review. Sometimes we will be able to review that material. So there's what's called a red line. So there's a precedent document, the revisions in this document, and you'll compare what changes people have made and think about why they've done that. I think that's more of an interesting thought exercise because it makes you think about how the conditions in the market have changed and why that has happened. Another thing that we'll do is signature page tracking, which is not the most thought-provoking exercise in the world, but it's extremely important in order to make sure that everyone signs off on those documents. One of the most rewarding experiences is creating transactional diagrams. So for the work that I do, we have to focus on making sure that all of assets of companies are put into bankruptcy remote entities. Those are called SPVs, special purpose vehicles. And when we're setting up these very large transactions, it's usually very esoteric. There are tons of parties involved. So I have been helpful and I found it very rewarding to help create those diagrams because you'll put, here's the parent entity, here are the entities below it, here are the ones that we are creating, here are all of the documents that we do, and you draw arrows to show who is a party to the document and then how assets are moving. So I find that to be a very fun thought exercise because when you have a checklist of 75 pages of documents, it's very easy to see how and why they relate to one another and what the process is behind that. The work I do is a little too specific to go into too much detail just because a lot of people don't necessarily care about capital markets, but I find it to be very rewarding when I'm able to draft documents. A lot of the times once you've been working at somewhere for 3 or 4 months, you have your feet underneath you, the attorneys will trust you with first drafts of things, which is a very nice experience. Granted, they definitely look at it because I am not a lawyer. I do not have the credentials to do this, but it's a nice experiment to see how and why things change. Just like comparing those red lines as to what other parties did, you do that internally as well.
That's really interesting. So you mentioned that you got this position hoping to eventually maybe move into the nonprofit world. And so we were wondering, after some time working here, are you finding that the work is preparing you for a career in that world? Or are you interested in maybe going to law school? Have you changed your plans at all based on your experience at White & Case?
Yes, thank you. I have. So when I had initially started for the 6 months that I was there at the beginning, I was convinced that I would leave after 2 years. I would go to grad school and I would work at a nonprofit. And then I started living and working in New York City, and it is so expensive. And it made me realize that in order to do what I want to do and feel like I have the financial freedom, I started very seriously considering going to law school after about 6 months. And then I have recently applied to law school, and now I'm choosing between a few. I've been waitlisted at BC Law, and I'm choosing between Northeastern and American, both on merit scholarship, which is a wonderful thing to have under my belt. But thank you. I changed from thinking about going into the nonprofit world to being more focused on the JD just because I really love the work that I do. I think it's very interesting. I'm very interested in looking at small businesses, entrepreneurs, finding ways to empower people within a community. The nonprofit, the pro bono work that I've done at White & Case has been reminiscent of the nonprofit work that I did in the past, and that has been very rewarding for me. My parents are in a divorce, and while I have been at my law firm, I've had the opportunity to work with an organization called Her Justice. They help women file for uncontested divorce cases in New York City. And that has been one of the most rewarding experiences that I've done for pro bono work. And it reminds me how powerful it is to have someone who has legal expertise helping people that don't necessarily have the same voice as others. Just from seeing my own mom's experience, she has access to capital and she's still having an extremely hard time navigating that. And it makes me disappointed in how challenging it is to navigate our entire legal structure. So the idea of going to law school, being able to work at a firm and then volunteering pro bono and potentially leaving after like 4 years to do something at a firm that's a little more meaningful than big law is where my head is at the moment. And I'm very excited about the opportunity to go to law school and explore other areas of law. Corporate law has been fascinating, but it'll be interesting to see what else is out there.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. So, do you have any advice for people considering law school, especially with regards to the application process and taking the LSAT or just career discernment in general?
Absolutely. So for the application process, I have noticed this year, based on my experience and experiences of friends, that it's been highly competitive. There was a 30 to 50% increase in applications across the board based on the pandemic. It was because a lot of students have graduated and as a result of not having job offers immediately after graduating with the pandemic, a lot of people studied very, very hard for the LSAT and did extremely well. And it just made it a much more competitive year than it has been in the past. What I really recommend doing, I did not start studying for the LSAT in college because I was not sure that I wanted to go to law school. I started about last summer in June, and I studied for 4 months straight. But trying to study while having a full-time job that's over 60 hours a week is extremely challenging. So I highly recommend that if you do want to go to law school, you start studying for the LSAT earlier and you set designated time aside for it. If students are thinking about doing it but want to be a paralegal first, I think that's a wonderful thing. But during this time that you don't have a job and if classes are a little bit slower, I would recommend just becoming more familiar with the model. It's been a strange year because the LSAT has been remote, so it's on your computer in your home. I think that presents an opportunity for students who test better in the place that they study. I know test day nerves do get in the way for some students. So if that's something that you're interested in, I believe through the summer at least, they're doing that remotely and it might stay in place. So you could consider taking the LSAT sooner than later. And that score is good for 5 years. So you can choose to go now, you can choose to go later, but I have a younger sister who is debating going to law school, and I keep emphasizing to her, I'm like, you graduated last year. You don't have something to do right now. Please study for either the GRE, GMAT, or LSAT now, because you don't understand how challenging it is to fit life in studying when it comes to that. For the application process, I recommend casting a wide net. Originally, when I applied, I had the intention of applying to about 10 schools, similar to the schools that I applied to for college. I only applied to 8 colleges, and I thought that that's all I needed to do for law school. But then once I started hearing back from law schools, or when I didn't hear back, I applied in early January, end of December. It took about 3-4 months for me to hear back from schools. I realized that I should start applying to more. So I ended up applying to 27, which I don't necessarily recommend doing in a non-pandemic year, but I would apply to schools that you necessarily didn't think you'd be interested in, because that merit scholarship from schools that aren't necessarily at the top 30 really does offer more flexibility. I am interested in going into big law after school, so the idea of having debt isn't as crushing as a few of my friends who are more interested into going to public service. But I don't recommend taking out $250,000 in debt to go into public service, because you'll be paying that off till you're 50.
That's really helpful. I actually watched my roommate go through the law school application process in the fall, so I know how involved it is.
It's crazy, honestly.
Yeah. One thing we were wondering about is how you think your international studies major and background has prepared you for law school and for the work you currently do in the legal environment.
Absolutely. I Loved my IS classes. They were absolutely my favorite in school because there was critical thinking involved in every single one of them. So while the topic and subject matter isn't necessarily discussed on a daily basis in the world that I work in, like the reading, writing, comprehension skills are definitely useful. Honestly, writing is something that a lot of people take for granted. I work with some people who are very brilliant people but don't know how to write well, and that is something that Boston College, specifically the IS program, really emphasized with the amount of papers that we had, the structure that is informed in those, and that's a skill that you'll take through forever. For law school, I think it's similar in the fact that you can create a cohesive argument based on the information that you're presented. And yes, it's not necessarily that I'll be focused on international relations law, but the ability to have a framework to look at information is the most valuable part of the IS program.
Awesome. Are there any skills that you wish that you had developed more before graduating?
Language skills. I spoke French in college and I was grateful for that. But now that I am in the work environment, we have a wonderful LatAm practice, and there are people in my office speaking Portuguese and Spanish on a daily basis. And I have no comprehension of what they're saying, and it makes me feel very ignorant. Specifically Spanish, living in New York City on the Upper West Side, where I walk into the grocery store and people start speaking to me in Spanish. I really wish that I had taken more time for the language skills.
That's really helpful. Thank you. How have you found mentors throughout your education at BC and your current job?
Absolutely. Mentors, a lot of mentors were in classes or graduating students. I was involved in a lot of clubs on campus, and I found that was a really good way to find not necessarily mentors for classes, but mentors for learning to be a person and adulting, because that's really honestly challenging, and you don't think about it until after you graduate and then have to pay rent for the first time and figuring out all of those skills. So I was a member of the dynamics, and I really relied on those upperclassmen because I was in contact with seniors when I was a freshman, and just seeing how they went through class selection processes was very helpful. Similarly, in the work environment, I work with a few other legal assistants, but because I am so siloed, I rarely work with people my own age. Almost all the time I'm working with lawyers who are either 3 or 4 years out of graduation and partners. And what I find to be really wonderful in that is just asking questions when you have the ability to look at something critically and say, but why are we doing this? The people will respond really well. And a lot of times that will lead to a longer conversation while they take time out of their day and explain the larger process. And through doing that at work, I've found some really helpful mentors who are helping me through the law school application process and discerning which school I should go to, because they can speak to their own experience. And I think it's similar in any job that you have. A lot of the times, unless you're in banking or consulting, when you join with a class and you really only work with people your year, a lot of the times you're working with people who have gone through the same steps that you have. And what I was grateful for at my firm is when I was expressing to them at the beginning that I wasn't sure that I wanted to go to law school, one of my best and favorite mentors, Kate, was expressing, well, don't feel pressured. Like, you work at a law firm now, but that doesn't mean you have to go to law school. Like, you could go to business school. Like, let me talk to you about business school. My husband's in business. So I found that that was a really nice opportunity, that when you express doubt or questioning, a lot of people have had those same thoughts throughout their experience as well. So they're very happy to talk about that.
Wonderful. I'm happy that the BC Alumni Network really proved helpful for you. So you mentioned earlier that your work has been remote for over a year. So you're wondering how your work has changed during COVID and how you deal with things like Zoom fatigue or just like making connections, like these like really valuable connections over a computer screen.
It's definitely challenging. And I feel for people who have been hired since we've been working remotely, because it is hard just to hear what's going on in the office. Beforehand, I was located in like a center cubicle, and all the people I worked with had offices around me, open doors, and they would just chat. So I would know what deals were going on in the background, what was coming down the pipeline, without having to be looped in on emails or anything more formal. A lot of that has been lacking recently, and we have tried to get around that by setting up meetings. So we have standalone meetings on Mondays and Fridays, just to get in contact with everyone on the team, ask how people are doing, what's going on in everyone's lives, because we were so connected with one another when we were in the office. We knew who was getting married when they were getting married, who was moving into a house, and all of those very personal details that makes the work very rewarding. So I think having those very quick 30-minute meetings has been very helpful. Gratefully, we don't have too many work meetings during the day, because I could imagine Zoom fatigue would get very demanding. We'll only have about 2 or 3 half-hour meetings, so that makes it a lot easier. We have what's called Jabber, which is the equivalent of text messaging. So instead of sending a formal email, it's like Slack. You just send a quick one-off, and that's been very helpful for catching up or doing casual things. We have been doing lunches over Zoom once a week, which has been a nice touch, just because it gives you that opportunity to talk about people's lives, families, how law school applications are doing, just things that don't necessarily come up in a work meeting. But yes, it's more challenging working remotely, and hopefully you will all be in offices soon, because there's so much learning that goes on that you're not cognizant of when you're in the classroom. Make sure that if you do work remotely, you set boundaries. It's very challenging. I live and work in the same apartment, and I work out in this apartment, and just everything is here. So people will sometimes forget that you need to turn off your computer for 20 minutes to eat lunch, or like go for a walk and leave. And at the beginning of the pandemic, it was hard to find that balance, but people now have been much better at just blocking off personal time. Since there's no commuting time at the end of the night, a lot of people will send emails at like 7 or 8 and expect an immediate response. And just communicating with people clearly when you need some time off is really important for your mental sanity.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. So that kind of wraps up the questions that Mahima and I had prepared, but we wanted to just open up the floor for anyone to ask any questions they might have for Kyra.
I have a question. I was wondering, during like job applications and applications for law schools, kind of what you found to be the most important factors. Like for law school, did you think it was GPA or your LSAT score? Or for when you were doing job experiences, was it internships that you had and like previous work experiences, or was it your cover letter and like connections you had?
Absolutely. For law school, I definitely think the LSAT is a significant factor, just because it's a gating item. If you don't have an LSAT score that falls within like that middle range, a lot of the times schools won't tell you, but they won't consider you, just because a lot of the rankings are based on GPA and LSAT. I'm sure you all have wonderful GPAs, given that you're IS students at BC. So that's not something that I would worry as much, but I do think that the LSAT is just a hurdle that you have to jump over. And then once you are through that, it really falls down onto the experiences that you've had, your personal statement. But law school was more focused on undergraduate achievements than I put weight on, because I've had 3 years of professional experience. I thought that was what would define my application. And after applying, I really noticed that it really does emphasize those scores and your academic performance. So if you have a thesis, maybe emphasize that. Just focus on the academic achievements that you have, because they want to make sure that you have demonstrative experience for learning, not necessarily for performing. I think it was different for job applications. That really fell down to what experience have you had in the past and what connections do you have. So for me, I have been working since the age of 16. I had a job during school. I worked almost 2 jobs every summer, one during the day, one during the night. And I started a business with my sister when I was 16. So all of those things definitely helped me secure the job that I wanted to do. And having international experience was something that was, it's shown on my application. It was always something that was mentioned when I went into interviews. And it's a really unique factor that a lot of BC students have, but a lot of other students don't necessarily have the same focus on that. So I think there is the dichotomy versus if you want to focus on going to graduate school right away or focus on a job, which one you should emphasize. But you can always reach out to the person at the organization you're trying to get to, or someone who's in the law school, and ask their personal experience too, just to make sure that I'm not saying something that was true for me, but not for everyone else.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kyra. This has really been so helpful, and it's great to hear how thoughtful you are in reflecting on your own path. I appreciate it. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about the value of any particular classes at BC or your thesis experience with regard to the way you think now, the process that, I mean, it's really helpful to hear that employers were interested in your internship in Geneva, et cetera. But any other things related to what students can do here or what they're doing here at BC that you felt translated either in the way you think or the way you move through the world or the process of getting where you are?
Absolutely. Some of all of my favorite classes were IS based. One of the ones that I very much loved was an Israeli and Palestinian seminar that I took my freshman year. I thought that was wonderful because I came in with preconceived notions from my senior year of high school where I looked at the conflict and I became opinionated in one way, thinking like this is clearly like right and wrong. I went into that seminar and it was taught in such a way that you were forced to evaluate both sides of the situation, and the grace that was navigated in discussions with other students is something that you take for granted when you leave an academic environment. It's very challenging to admit that maybe you were looking at something in a very narrow focus, or that your view could be changed in any way that you didn't expect it to be changed when you're out in the real world, because people hate being wrong. But when you're in school, it's such a wonderful opportunity to evaluate why you have the beliefs that you have, what's influencing that, how are you shaping it, and then how do you communicate with that. So that Israeli-Palestinian seminar my freshman year really set up my college trajectory in a wonderful way, because I took that same framework into the rest of my courses that I had as an undergraduate. I also was a history minor, so I would take classes that were evaluating historic events, and you're thinking about how and why things are shaping one another. And that's an extremely important skill that employers will look at, and they value that because it shows that you can take a lot of information, think about the important factors and how things interplay with one another. It's also an amazing skill to have when you're reading the news and you're thinking about how things are being shaped to you, what is necessarily accurate, what is someone's opinion, and all of those thought processes that you engage with at BC really, really help define the way that you interact with the world on a daily basis. Other classes that I really loved was Professor Owen's Ethics, Religion, and International Politics. It's still one of my favorite classes that I've ever engaged with. Just because, again, it's a sensitive subject matter, but you're able to think about it in a thoughtful way, talk with other students, create cohesive decisions, and just understanding about how and why people see things a certain way.
Thanks for the shout out. I appreciate it. It was great. I was remembering the class that you took with me, that we took together, was in the building that's now been torn down and is where the Schiller Institute is being built. So we were in Cushing Hall one of the years before it was torn down, and now it's this gigantic science building that opens up in this fall. So you have to come back and check it out when you're.
I'll have to come see it.
Yeah. Anyway.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kyra. Actually, I was going to say that Grace and I also took Arab with Professor Owens, and I think we both loved it. It was so helpful. But thank you so much for coming today and sharing all this amazing advice. This is really helpful. I'm sure for everybody who came and everyone who's going to watch the YouTube recording. So I was just wondering, if students want to reach out and connect with you, what's the best way that they can do that?
Absolutely. Email is the best. It's my name, so it's kyra.e.luck@gmail.com.
Okay.
You're welcome to send it out to everyone too. I think you.
Okay, great. I'll do that. Okay, thank you so much, Kyra, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And so with that, we can just wrap up. But this was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks so much.